Thank you for that reading.
You're welcome.
I actually wanted to ask you about that ending because one of the most marked things about Citizen, and that people have written about and asked you about, is how much of it takes place in the second person. So that you can be white or black. You don't know, in some instances, who is white or who is black, or where the tension in the relationship lies. You don't know whether the you is a stand-in for the I, or whether the you is an other. But towards the end, you do this amazing thing where suddenly you go from you to I, he. Do I get the sequence right? I, he, she. Let me just get the sequence right because I don't want to mess it up because it's so beautiful. And yes, I want to interrupt to tell him, her, us, you, me, I don't know how to end it. That comes up in a few places towards the end. So I was just wondering what you were thinking and doing when it suddenly opens up like that.
Well, the use of the second person was one of those moments where, as a writer, you understand the amount of mobility it allows you.
Yeah.
And so when it occurred to me that these stories should be told in the second person, for practical reasons, I didn't own them. And then I had this little joke, which was, I'm talking about the other, or the othering of another.
Yes.
And so that's the second person.
Yeah.
So that, this is how I get my jokes. And so, so that was very funny to me. But inside, as you mentioned, inside the you can be plural, singular, it can be intimate, and also accusative. And so I loved the range in there. But I didn't want to end the book without reclaiming the centralizing I, because it seemed to me that part of the problem of systemic racism is that one internalizes the racism and loses the steadying figure of the I. So I needed to bring us back into a place where a speaker could speak for themselves. And all of the pronouns could exist in the place that they exist.
So interesting. So they settle back down.
They settle back down.
Don't Let Me Be Lonely is a very different book. Although there are moments that are shared, like George Bush's reaction to the lynching of, what's his name again? Can you say it?
Now I have Darrell Deadman in my head, but
I'm sorry.
It'll come.
In
I'm
Texas,
too old.
he was dragged behind a car, and there were three men driving the car.
What is his name? James Byrd.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. It's so important to say the name.
Mm-hmm.
And this on stage, suddenly the name goes blank. And actually, that's a beautiful thing that you meditate on in the book, which I want to get back to, saying the name of the dead, the names of the dead. But in Don't Let Me Be Lonely, there's a moment thinking about that. And but there's also a sense in which it is a collective story. Don't Let Me Be Lonely. And Citizen is a collective story. Mm-hmm. Did either of them begin as more autobiographical stories? Were there more autobiographical moments in either of those books that you then decided not to include?
Don't Let Me Be Lonely was a book where I felt I could do whatever I wanted in order to create the book I wanted. So I would appropriate stories, I would use the first person, it became, the first person became a sort of a gear shift or something to move through the landscape in order to bring up the culture of the post 9/11 time, where we were being shown how to construct fear against another. So in that book, I was interested in affect in the way that bias is created inside the body. And so the stories were just pulled in. In Citizen, there is a much more conscious effort to create a community document.
Yes.
And I think part of it, I had a sense in this book that I needed to get it right. That I needed, if I had written this book based only on my life, then I was afraid people would say to me, "I'm sorry you have that life." And that there would be a lot of sympathy coming towards me. And in fact, I have a kind of nice life, so in many ways. But then there was this other thing, this sort of communal knowledge of what it means to have a Black body in this country. And so the minute I began to solicit stories, then I had this sense that I had to get it right, because the people whose stories I had would be sitting in the audience sometime, and I didn't want them to feel like, oh, she's misrepresenting what I told her. So then the making of this book was a very different feel. It had that sense of actually being sort of almost anthropology, like pulling things in and restating them in order to create a general picture of what it feels like to walk around in a Black body. So in that sense, they were different. So the autobiographical in here came in only when I felt that a story of mine was important to add a dimension that hadn't come up otherwise. So when I did that thing where I said to my friend, next time go in the backyard, it was a lesson to me in terms of how racism is inside everybody. And so everybody's adjusting to it. Either you're dealing it or you're reacting to the injury of it, or you're trying to cut it off, or you're anticipating it and shifting in some way. And so in that sense, I think, for me, autobiography perhaps is more present in here when it needs to be present.
I mean, the reason I was wondering about that connection between the two books and your beautiful answer to it is because they're both called An American Lyric, and there's a sense in which it's everybody's story. And in both of them, it's everybody's story. And it's such an interesting use of the word lyric, because the lyric poem in its ancient beginnings is spoken from the point of view of a single person. And so to have a collective lyric is incredibly moving, I think, really original, and yet also keeping in a tradition a bit like what Wordsworth and Coleridge were doing with the lyrical ballads, trying to speak from the whole community, and yet have it be an internal experience of it that is a single person's speaking of it in a way. So the meeting of your voice with those stories is a very interesting thing.
Yeah, it's funny, I love Wordsworth. What is that? Getting and spending, we lay waste our hours, little we see in nature that is ours. But that sense of being able to reflect on a cultural dynamic as it moves through individual bodies.
Yes.
And so in this sense, everything in this book did move through a single body. It came to me and then it came out. And so, in as much as the lyric is concerned with affect and feeling and the internal voice, this book for me is in the realm of, it's a book for me about intimacy and the ways in which intimacy gets polluted by bias. And it becomes impossible then for people to move forward.
It puts the two who suddenly are facing the wall of racism. Mm-hmm. There are several instances with friends where suddenly it comes in. I made a note of a couple of them where what comes up is, to me, is the double bind. That when you can't confront the inherent dilemma and therefore can neither resolve it nor opt out of the situation. It's just there. Mm-hmm. Let's see, let me just see if I can quickly just read to people so they have a sense of that. Of course, many people here know this book very well already. There's a friend, it's on page 14, a friend argues that Americans battle between the historical self and the self-self. And then you meditate on this American positioning. And then this moment happens where then you are standing face to face in seconds that wipe the affable smiles were off your mouths. What did you say? Instantaneously, your attachment seems fragile, tenuous, subject to any transgression of your historical self. And though your joined personal histories are supposed to save you from misunderstandings, they usually cause you to understand all too well what is meant. And there's another story of two friends meeting, and one of them's late, and the other one says, let's see, on page 41, 42.
You're not beheaded whole.
Yeah, that's the one. And for all your previous understandings, suddenly incoherence feels violent. You both experience this cut, which she keeps insisting is a joke stuck in her throat. And like any other injury, you watch it rupture along its suddenly exposed suture.
I think one of the difficulties, it's funny because the person who told me that story, I saw her recently and I said to her, oh, whatever happened to that woman who said that? And she said, well, it's difficult for me to be as intimate as we were. And I was thinking about this. Recently I was at, my husband says not to name these colleges, so I won't. He sometimes watches these, and he's like, don't do that. So I won't do it. But I was at a Ivy League school, let's put it that way, since it's true. And there was a woman who was the head of a social justice institute, and she, at a certain point, said to us, we had watched the film had 4 black men. In the film, there were 4 mothers, the mothers of the 4 black men. And after the film,
This is The Cooler Bandits?
That's my husband's film, The Cooler Bandits. And after the film, she came up and she said, so which one of the guys had the mother who sounded white? And it's one of those moments where you begin to understand that for all her good work, that she sees whiteness as owning education, and blackness, instead of education just being education. and blackness as being some subpar existence. And so every time we have an interaction with her, that moment is in play in the interaction. Even though we said, "What do you mean by that?" And she said, "Oh, I don't mean what you think I mean." So I was like, well, but those moments, they stay, and even as you move forward, it distances you from that person, because then you begin to understand that the black body is the black body and not another person.
That's right. So even though it was not her intention, and this gets into very interesting issues of intention, what she said has a bigger history than her saying it in that moment and her intending it to use it in some way that she wanted to intend.
Right. And this is somebody who does a lot of good work, you know, but then you begin to question the relationship between that person and the object of the good work, you know? So it's a curious thing, interesting.
I don't know if you want to talk about this, so you can just say no, but that makes me think of something that I think you're thinking about right now, that you're writing about, because we were talking earlier.
She's clairvoyant.
Which has to do with going back to elegy. The elegy's work is amongst other things is to ritually bury the unburied, so the naming of the names. There's a very interesting difference between the different editions of Citizen. Or Fiona McRae is in the audience. I should have asked her first. But there's it's on pages. They're blank. They're not numbered, but it's page 133 and 134. In the first edition, it says November 23rd, 2012, in memory of Jordan Russell Davis, the boy who was killed for being in a car that was playing loud music. February 15th, 2014, the justice system, which was the date that his murderer was finally acquitted of first-degree murder after a mistrial. In the second edition, I believe, I don't own the second edition.
It says, in memory of Jordan Russell Davis, in memory of Eric Gardner, in memory of John Crawford, in memory of Michael Brown, in memory.
Well, that's like a third edition, I think.
Because
there was a one in between. Nick Laird wrote about it in the New York Review of Books.
And there was
another, which was just three names, and then you changed that page. And I was just thinking about, events, since you published this book, events happen all the time. It's not, this is nothing new. But in the media, suddenly, there's a lot more attention, and obviously on the streets. But since you published this book, things are happening so fast, how does one keep up with it? And if the important thing is to, it goes back to the ancient Greek ritual of naming the dead as a way of resurrecting them and then allowing them to be buried again. That the type fades now down the page, memory of, as if anticipating all the future deaths that we will have to honor. And what that's like for you as an artist, just, there's the moral responsibility to what's going on in the world, and then there's the artistic responsibility to your work. And also thinking about Antigone, committing a crime against the state for wanting to bury her brother. And you had recently, in a conversation we were having, we're talking about the black body, the dead black body. Mm-hmm. Do you want to say something about that?
Sure. Recently somebody asked me about the epigraph of the book, which is, if they don't see happiness in the picture, at least they'll see the black. And that's from Chris Marker's Sans Soleil, Without the Sun. Mm-hmm. And I used it because it had to do with, for Marker, it had to do with a landscape being haunted by the dead. Mm-hmm. The black in Sans Soleil is really a volcano has wiped out the place where people were living. But overall, for Marker, there's a way in which all of his films are interested in what it means to be in a constant state of mourning. And for me, I think that the condition of Black lives is a state of mourning. And what our contemporary culture has done with our video cameras and our Facebook mm-hmm. and the internet is insist that that mourning stay present. So the thing that we were talking about earlier was the fact that I'm really interested right now in the grievable body. What does it mean to have a body like Michael Brown's body? Tamir Rice is still not buried, apparently. These bodies that are that remain in public view. And at first it seemed odd, like these families should have closure in the way that anybody should have closure. But then suddenly these Black bodies are being turned into evidence, and so we need them to say, this is happening, as if it hasn't always been happening. Mm-hmm. But suddenly we need it to say that. And so I've been thinking about what it means to have grief be an ambient feeling. Mm-hmm. So interesting. A feeling that is just out there. Like air, it just stays. And so then I thought, in a sense, what we want, and I'm using this we loosely, is to turn that feeling into a national feeling. So that's why I think the actions of people like Black Lives Matter, for example, that all they're really doing is saying, we're going to keep the grief present. Mm-hmm. And that's, in a sense, as you said, the naming, keeping the names present in this book is also a way of saying, if the condition of Black lives is a condition of mourning, how do we get that grief to become a national grief and not one that is held only in the Black body? And so suddenly these bodies present, it's almost the inverse of Antigone, because in Sophocles' Antigone, or if you read it in the way that Hegel would have you read it, the state is wrong. The state is wrong for wanting the body to stay out there, and that there's a higher power that should bring the body in, to bury the body. But in this case, suddenly it seems to me that having the body present is functioning in a way that might ultimately create movement inside the body politic. So I don't know, but this is what I'm thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you.